The reality is that free trade on the continent isn't possible without a technology like blockchain, without stablecoins.
Hello, I'm Jeremy Allaire, and this is The Money Movement. I'm really excited today to have a great guest, Chris Maurice, who's the co-founder and CEO of Yellow Card, a really innovative firm that is bringing the power of stablecoins and crypto infrastructure to a really broad group of people and businesses in Africa. So Chris, welcome to the show.
Great to be here, man.
Awesome. Well, I was just commenting before we got started. You had a really nice profile in Bloomberg. I don't know if it was yesterday or today or what that is, which huge kudos. I think the Yellow Card story is a really exciting story. And so we'll do our own version of it, much better than the Bloomberg piece today and talk about it. And just to share with the audience, I've had the benefit of knowing you for a little while and working with you and seeing the progress that you're making. And so, first of all, just congrats on the progress.
We're trying to be big boys like y'all, man, one day at a time.
Yeah. So let's do this. Maybe, maybe I'll do a little bit of framing and then we'll kind of dive into your story a bit, which is, I think, there's, a lot of interest in stablecoins right now. It's sort of like a hot thing, like people are buying companies for lots of money, and that's not the main point of it, but it's attracting a huge amount of attention. And we've kind of got to this place where the technology of stablecoins really works, and the benefits are really powerful, which we're going to get into. But there's been this talk about the growth of stablecoins in emerging and developing markets. We certainly see that as Circle with USDC, just like, with like partnerships with like you guys and so many others around the world. The growth in the adoption of stablecoins for quote unquote cross-border transactions as well. As I like to joke, and I've joked for like 10 years, a cross-border transaction is like sending a cross-border email at this point. So, a lot of these are going to get blurry because of stablecoins. But anyway, we have this big backdrop, and I get asked questions all the time about like, tell me about these uses, tell me about these, what's happening. And what I love about Yellow Card and why I'm so excited to have you on the show today is you've got really deep ground truth on this. And so I want to go into that ground truth and bring to life a little bit the stories of people whose lives are being impacted by this. And obviously, where you're headed as a company. So that's like the backdrop from my perspective. And maybe just to start, give us the founding story and kind of, I know from building companies, right, where you start and where you are today, there's pivots and there's evolutions and all that stuff. And you don't need to go through every pivot you've had as a company, but like you've really landed on something now. And so I'd love to hear about the founding and kind of love to hear kind of how that's gotten you, where you are today.
Long story short, right? So I grew up in New Orleans, went to school at Auburn in Alabama. So I'm about as Southern as it gets. And
my son is going to school in New Orleans, actually. So
I love to hear that. Tulane, good school. Yeah, and so well in school, got into Bitcoin first, right? I think most people get into the space through Bitcoin, right? So I got in pretty early in 2013. My co-founder Justin was the guy who would, go around parties back in the day, just evangelizing the gospel of Bitcoin, right? He's a real tall, sweaty guy. So he'd have like 6 people in a corner just hovering over them, just talking about Bitcoin and converting the masses. And, that went on until about 2015. And at that point I was fully down the rabbit hole, right? Like, this is the best thing ever. This is what I'm doing with the rest of my life. And so we got to work, right? And I think what we ended up landing on a couple years later, so now about 2017, was we were going to put a gift card in CVS, Walmart, places like that. You'd be able to walk in, buy this gift card, and redeem it for Bitcoin. And so, we started building this out. And one day I'm at a Wells Fargo in Auburn, Alabama, of all places. And there's a Nigerian guy in line waiting to send $200 to his family. And the bank charged him $90 to send $200 over to his mom. And I thought, well, this seems ridiculous, right? And so, I talked to the guy, hey, have you heard of Bitcoin? It's free, it's instant, it's fun, all this great stuff. And, went home and just started thinking, what's this guy's mom going to do with $200 of Bitcoin, right? Like, you can't buy food with that. You can't pay rent with that, right? What problem are we actually solving here? And, especially at the time, everybody in the industry loved to talk about, practical use cases and solutions. And there was just nothing actually practical about it at the time for, somebody in Lagos, right? And so, look, I don't think I knew where Nigeria was on a map at the time. They don't teach you nearly as much about Africa as you might think in the Louisiana education system. So it comes as a surprise to some people, but, you can prep your son for that. Just really became obsessed with that problem, right? I find myself skipping class and just doing research, trying to understand, the country and the currency, the continent, and the banking system and everything. And eventually I realized if I want to understand Nigeria, I need to speak to somebody from there. I'd been on a plane 4 times in my life before starting the company. And I land in Lagos, Nigeria on a 6-day-old passport, no visa, no shots, and a one-way ticket that we spent all of our money on. So, it was a real trial by fire, right? So, we weren't going to do it the easy way. So, that's how we got started. And then, now fast forward, right? Obviously, the space has evolved quite a bit. And, I think for us, it was really, 2021 where things shifted completely from Bitcoin to stablecoins. And I mean, it's just a pretty clear transition. Early 2021, where everybody just was
Yeah, we had, just for perspective, from the beginning of 2020 to the end of 2020, we grew USDC 1,000%, and then the beginning of 2021 to the end of 2021, we grew USDC another 1,000%. So it was like that was the time when basically stablecoins started working. And the stablecoin liquidity got everywhere, and I mean, now it's obviously even bigger in terms of the scope and reach and adoption and stuff. But that was a good time to pivot to stablecoins.
100%, man. And I guess for context now, right, we're the largest licensed stablecoin payments infrastructure for Africa and the emerging world, right? So we operate in 20 countries, all in sub-Saharan Africa, and work with businesses of all shapes and sizes, make it easy for them to access stablecoins, to make international payments, to manage their treasury, to, essentially, access the equivalent of the dollar, do anything that you would use the dollar for, anything that you or I would use our US bank account to do. Businesses across the emerging world don't have that privilege, right? And they need an alternative to be able to, make those transactions and save.
Yeah. So that's, I want to dive in. I want to dive into that. This is the meat on the bone, right? Which is real world utility value from this new alternative to the legacy banking system, and made possible through products like USDC and USDT and others, right? And I'd be interested in maybe a few different angles on this. Is sort of maybe tell a story or two, maybe about a household or an individual, and maybe a story about, a business and their discovery of what stablecoins could do for them, and kind of, and how, and, kind of the kind of hurdles that maybe people have had to overcome, or questions, or what are the challenges they've had to overcome. And then once they've started, once they've kind of come through that, how they think about all this.
Yeah, it's hard to pick, one or two stories, right? I mean, we could do the whole show just talking about, use cases around this, right? But you hear every day around, people using stablecoins for savings, right? In countries on the continent that have very high inflation, right? I mean, some countries have peaked at almost 100% over the past 2 years. People are using this technology just to store their wealth, right? Just to store any money that they're able to bring in something that's secure, right? I mean, we know plenty of families that receive money from overseas and they prefer to receive it in stablecoins, because if you don't receive it in stablecoins, then you're getting all the local currency at once, right? And they don't need to spend all the local currency at once. They need it, over the course of several weeks. At 100% inflation, it takes a while.
Yeah. Yeah. So you're giving them with the yellow card app, basically, like you're giving them the end-to-end kind of experience to both store, send, save, receive, and then are you also providing like the kind of on and off ramps to the local banking systems or mobile money systems or other things that are needed? Like there is always the like I got to pay my utility bill or I got to what have you. How does that work for people who are using it?
Yeah, I mean, so from our side, we serve predominantly businesses, right? And we have two main products. So we have the on and off ramp, which is pretty much exactly what it sounds like, right? It's the full end-to-end payment flow, right? So you're in any country on the continent that we serve, you need to make a payment. You need to settle an invoice in China, in India, in Europe, anywhere like that, right? Or, vice versa, you need to bring that money in, right? You're a large retailer that, needs to facilitate imports, or a large pharmaceutical importer that needs to import medicine. Then, that's one of the big use cases that businesses are using it for. The other main product that we have is our payments API, which I like to call Africa as a service. Essentially, what that does is that takes our bank accounts, our mobile money relationships, et cetera, across the continent, and just makes that available for companies to be able to utilize to serve their customers on the continent more effectively, right? So that's what Coinbase, for example, uses on the left side.
And so but does through that product, right? I'm an enterprise, or I'm another fintech, or I'm whatever I am. And am I basically like I'm integrating with that, and inside of that, you're providing the liquidity into things like USDC, and so they're able to kind of purchase USDC, store it, manage it, run transactions, redeem the USDC, and go out to their local banking or whatever as needed.
Yeah. So, essentially the way that it works is, a company that integrates it, any money that's collected, any like local payments that are collected, everything automatically gets converted into stable coins. And then vice versa, right? So, you hold USDC with us, and then you just tell us, make a payment to, Zambia, right? Make a payment to South Africa, et cetera.
Right. And how are the counterparties for those payments? Do they can use whatever Web3 compatible wallet that they have? Is it just like a wallet addresses that you're sending to, or do you encourage like the counterparties to also onboard into Yellow Card as well?
Yeah, so I mean, we handle the third-party payment, right? So I think in most cases, and I'm sure you guys have experienced this, outside of the U.S. and outside of the West, right? Most of our customers don't really care about stablecoins necessarily, right? They don't really care about the technology. They care about solving their problem, right? They care that they need to make a payment, and this is the best technology on earth to be able to do so. And so, for the vast majority of our customers, they want that payment terminated in a bank account, right? USDC becomes the rail as opposed to necessarily the settlement currency, right?
The stablecoin sandwich thesis we see a lot of that, definitely, which is amazing, right? Because it's like, effectively, like USDC becomes a substitute for the entire correspondent banking system and kind of international settlement pipes. Yeah.
Yeah, I can tell you for a fact, I know many fintechs on the African continent that are using, USDC, using USDT, have relationships with y'all, and just will openly say they don't touch, crypto, they don't do anything with blockchain, but are actually in practice using Circle on the back end for, facilitating a lot of these payments, right?
Yeah, and we're even seeing banks basically in many different markets who are.
And they'll never admit it. Yes.
I have some of them, the biggest emerging market bank in the world, like the most innovative, high growth emerging market bank, which is Nubank out of Latin America. Like USDC's front and center. They're really pushing it, and so I think they're they're like a fintech bank, but they're a true bank. Like they do credit, they do lending, they do investments, they do your whole portfolio banking services regulated by the central bank there in Brazil. Leaning in, we're going to see more and more of that blurring, right, between kind of crypto native firms, payment institutions, banks, et cetera. But that's amazing. So it sounds like are you finding? I guess maybe another way of asking is like, how much of the flows that you are involved in are within the sub-Saharan sub-Saharan Africa versus with other, export, import markets that are off the African continent? And do you measure that at all?
Yeah, we do, right? The majority of it is imports to the continent at large, right? It's things, goods, raw materials, consumer goods, et cetera, coming in from Europe, coming in from the UK, coming in from India, coming in from China. And yeah, I think, one of the things that we're working on actually with, PAPS and some of the other companies that are involved from like the African Union level is, how do you encourage more intra-African trade, right? The AFCFTA, which is now in place, right, is supposed to create this free trade union within the continent, right? And pretty much every country is signed on to it. And, look, that's a great first step. But the reality is that free trade on the continent isn't possible without a technology like blockchain, without stablecoins, without a advancement in payment technology. Right. A large part of the reason that intra-African trade is 5 times smaller than intra-European or intra-North American trade is not because people hate each other. It's because it's very difficult to make a payment. It's extremely difficult to make a payment, right? And the thing is even if I want to pay from, say, Ghana to, anywhere, right? Or, I'm paying from Senegal to Kenya. That payment is going through New York, it's going through London, and then it's landing in Nairobi on the other side, right? And so it's just not conducive to, encouraging trade on the continent.
Yeah. I have a bunch of follow-up questions I'd love to hear your perspective on. So one is just within the use case of these businesses that want to use this because it's a sort of better, faster, cheaper way to actually facilitate payments. How many of them are also sort of, looking to store value in digital dollars like USDC, as opposed to going out to their external banks where they maybe are subject to inflationary currencies or other is the store of value piece also being adopted by businesses, and are you providing some of that with your own wallet infrastructure?
I will say it's not nearly as big as the payments use case, right? I mean, the payments is an immediate problem. We need to solve this. Let's make this happen. There are a number of initiatives that we're working on specifically to encourage more of that savings aspect. What I will say, and I think this is good for you to hear as well, right? Is for USDC to really win on the savings piece, it needs to win on the payments piece as well, right? What we find is that these companies, when they want to hold money for any extended amount of time, they will always default to doing that in a method or account or whatever, where they then have immediate access to be able to do whatever they need with that money. Right. And so that's really key, is providing people a place where they can hold USDC and then they can make that dollar payment. They can make a euro payment. They can make a rupee payment, real payment, whatever they need to do. Right. Or they could just pull it out in shilling, right? They can pull it out in rand and in any currency that they need on the continent. And making sure that they have both of those pieces available is critical to really encouraging that.
Yeah. And it sounds like you're obviously checking a lot of boxes in terms of that interoperability with existing rails, right? In Africa and some other places too. So I guess another question that's related to this, which is, and this is sort of crossing a little bit into kind of the politics of all this, which is, probably, like I said at the start, like one of the first questions I get asked is like, tell me about these use cases for stablecoins that are, what's driving adoption, and we see like all around the world, like this emerging and developing market kind of uses and trade and cross-border payments, and like it's just a huge phenomenon. But one of the like questions that comes right after that is like, isn't this a problem for the local governments? Like, aren't the local governments concerned about payment systems that kind of bypass their own regulated payment systems? What are they going to do? Are they going to regulate this? Currency substitution like could undermine fiscal policy in some of these places, fiscal and monetary policy, but fundamentally it's fiscal, right? And like, isn't that a threat? Won't they just like crack down? I mean, we've seen like the Nigerian government like take actions just on basically OTC markets for stablecoins against the naira. In the Binance case, obviously, that's really at the core of it is just like a free market for people who want to trade naira for stablecoins. And so like it's a complex set of issues, obviously, and you have to navigate that as well. But like, what are you seeing on that front, and how do you think about that issue? And is there an enlightened pathway here for the continent to embrace this without it being somehow like threatening to their ability to kind of do what they need to do to run their governments?
Yeah, 100%, right. And I think for us, regulation has always been front and center, right? I think that you're not able to build a centralized exchange without being realistic about regulation and working with the regulators and treating them as stakeholders in the ecosystem, which they certainly are. I think when you look broadly across Africa, what you'll see is, over the last 2 years, the continent has had just a complete sea change in terms of friendliness towards the space, right? Sort of at the same time that, the last 2 years in the US has been pretty rough, right? And so it's really been great to watch. We've really been able to go in and work with a number of regulators across the continent, right? And so, today there's, licensing in Botswana, there's licensing in South Africa and Namibia and Mauritius, there's sandboxing in Zambia and Ghana, Rwanda, Uganda, right? There's, Nigeria, the SEC has released guidelines as of 2022 for licensing in the space, right? And they've taken over the regulation. And, look, I mean, obviously there's been, issues and concerns, especially in Nigeria around, AML, around, tax evasion, around, things like that they went after specific players for. But I think, the SEC, especially under the new deputy governor, Dr. Agama, I think has really been moving the industry forward in an innovative way in the country. And I think that, some of their recent actions show that, right? That they're open for business. They want to encourage this space. They want to regulate the space. And, they have the guidelines to do so. And so, I'm pretty bullish on, what we're going to see coming out of Nigeria. I think that, they see the amount of, jobs, the amount of money that, this industry is bringing into the ecosystem. And, what I would also say just from, a much higher level, right? And this is this is where I usually clash with like hardcore, crypto Twitter people, right? Is I don't see a day where you walk into a coffee shop in, Nairobi, and you're paying for your latte with USDC or Bitcoin or really any digital asset for that matter, right? I think that, local payments are largely solved for, right? If I'm in Nairobi, M-Pesa is the best way to make a payment, period. No matter where I am, I can pay my taxi driver, I can pay for groceries, I can, get food, I can do anything that I need, right? And so it's already sort of solved for, right, with mobile money and with certain other solutions. I think that where stablecoins are really coming in is not disrupting the local monetary system and the local payment rails. It's disrupting the international ones. It's disrupting SWIFT. Right. I mean, when I think about you guys, I think of y'all as a competitor to SWIFT, not necessarily a competitor to local currencies or anything like that. I think that USDC, USDT, all these stable coins are replacing the way that the dollar moves around the world, rather than actually affecting the way that money moves within local ecosystems.
Yeah. It's very interesting. Yeah, I mean, we definitely see variability in that across a lot of different places, where, for example, in Argentina, people it's somewhat dollarized already, but it's not actually dollarized, but people just want to hold stablecoins and store their value and use it for local payments. And it is used by 80% of people to buy the cup of coffee, right? It's sort of, if you go to Buenos Aires, everyone sort of accepts stablecoins. So there are variations of that theme, and I've had a chance to meet with some of the leaders of some of these big mobile money systems, and I think they're intrigued with what stablecoins can do in terms of that international interoperability, right? I think that's sort of we don't just have to be this walled garden where it's just sitting inside of, whether it's Kenya or Uganda or wherever it is. There's a way to, if digital wallets all around the world can speak USDC, a way to transact with all those other people and all those other businesses around the world, sort of that network value that kind of comes with that.
Oh, 100%. Yeah. And I mean, that to me is that's the, $20 trillion problem that's being solved, right? Is, money moving around the world in a, faster and more efficient way, right? I think the other big thing that I certainly see is, as opposed to retail, is e-commerce, right? Especially international e-commerce, right? When you need to make a payment, USDC is better for the merchant. It's better for, it's easier for the consumer. I think, look, we're not that far away from seeing, I think, sort of mass adoption of, stable coins for online payments. I think the only thing it's...
Yeah. I mean, Stripe, who's a partner of ours, they launched out of the box. Yes. Any merchant that uses their e-commerce system can flip a switch and take USDC payments alongside credit card payments. It just shows 100%. Up in the UI. Yeah. And we will see as the UX on wallets gets better and better, and things like gas fees go into the background, and people don't have to worry about what chain they're on. You get cross-chain abstraction, and a lot of these things that are user experience hurdles, as those things get solved, and they are being solved, I think we'll find ourselves in 2025 with, it'll be all of a sudden the merchants have figured out are going to be I'm able to better serve, a wide variety of audiences here, and it's better for me, and they want to promote it, and we'll kind of get the snowballing going. It'll take a few years, but it clearly is you can see it coming.
100%. And I think that companies like Stripe moving into that space is what's really going to help take that over the edge, right? Because look, right now, why do I use my credit card for everything? Because when I do, I get 2% back. I get consumer protection, and I don't actually have to pay it for 30 days, right? So there's actually several benefits that I think sort of get told for, using a credit card. And I think that, somebody like Stripe entering the mix in terms of processing the stablecoin payments they're able to add all of that stuff in if they want to, right? And I think, you'll have companies like Stripe, you'll have other major processors, you'll have other companies that'll pop up that will effectively make stablecoins.
Yeah, and there'll be like on-chain native versions of credit extension and transaction reversals, insurance against fraud, all these things, right? You're going to see, our hope is to see all of that develop on-chain and be natively intermediated by, Web3 infra, smart contracts, and kind of build that, entirely from the ground up on-chain.
100%. Yeah. You can have a decentralized version of it, right? And I think that's the thing that's really going to take it to the next level, right? Is when stablecoins are not just as easy, but are actually as, safe and have all the other perks, that really takes it to the next level. I'm kind of preaching to the choir here, so that's why.
Yeah, no, I know, but it's good. It's always good to riff about this.
If you told me you didn't agree, I think it'd be a bigger issue. So.
Yeah, but the thing is like there's a lot of people who tune into this podcast, and it's an evolving story. If you go back 4 years and start listening to the podcast 4 years ago and compare it to, now, talking about a lot of the same themes, but like where we are on that journey is incredibly, it's remarkable. The fact that I'm sitting here and we're talking about like real commerce moving online, cross-border trade moving through stablecoins, store of value, spanning entire continents, like leapfrogging payment systems. Like this was all, a dream, 4 or 5 years ago. And now we're living in that reality. And it's entrepreneurs like yourself that are bringing this to life as well. So it's pretty awesome.
The progress is incredible. And I think, what really gets me excited about it is we don't really know what the impact of that is going to be, right? I think, people speculate on what the impact of that can be. But, right now you have large portions of the population globally that cannot make online payments, right? You have, parts of the world like Africa where e-commerce is, far behind how much adoption there's been in like the US and Europe and China and other parts of the world, simply because of the payments issue. And so, think about the amount of jobs that can create on the continent when you open up e-commerce, right? When you open up the ability for these companies to be able to sell online, to, hire locally, do all this stuff locally, more deliveries, all of this. I mean, so it just, the amount of jobs it creates is,
yeah. Yeah. And access innovations in finance and financial services that are being built up on chain as well.
100%. 100%. So, and then there's, even on top of that, there's the trickle down effects, right? I like to brag about the fact that we have 6 former employees. We've not been around that long. We're not that big of a company, right? 250-ish people. And we have 6 former employees that have raised seed money for their own startups. Right. So, it's just a very entrepreneurial continent, right? People are just ready to solve problems. And, the impact of, stablecoins being able to open up jobs, being able to open up opportunities for people that then turn around, start their own company. And, it's a compounding effect, right? It's a compounding waterfall.
I love it. Well, we our formal mission statement, and it's been basically consistent since we founded it, is to increase global economic prosperity through the frictionless exchange of value. And I think like as you make value exchange as easy as the internet, and not just payments, but all kinds of value exchange that happen, like it grows economic prosperity and in many, many facets. And like you said, it's hard to imagine where it's going to go. It's fun to imagine where it's going to go, but it's. I think we've crossed. We're crossing the chasm in sort of tech market evolution speak, right? We're crossing the chasm, and we're getting onto what they call the slope of enlightenment, where the world truly wakes up and becomes enlightened and adopts this at mass scale. So. Well, it'll be fun to continue working on this together with you, Chris, and really appreciate you joining for the podcast, and excited to get the story out there.
We're always ready to party, brother. You let us know.
Thank you, Chris.